In the freezing depths of Lake Superior, more than 530 feet below the surface, something extraordinary is happening. A state-of-the-art underwater drone equipped with 4K cameras and advanced scanning systems is descending into darkness, piercing through water that hasn't seen light in nearly 5 decades. The research team on the surface holds its breath as the feeds from the drone begin transmitting back to their monitors, but they have no idea what they're about to discover. Evidence that will finally rewrite the story of the greatest maritime mystery in Great Lakes history. This is the moment that nearly 50 years of unanswered questions begins to crack open. This is the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald and the secrets that have been hiding on the lake bottom all this time. The water is pitch black, the temperature hovers just above freezing, and yet, as the drone's powerful lights cut through the murk, the ghostly outline of a massive steel wreck emerges from the sediment. It's a structure so enormous, so deliberately engineered, that it was once considered unsinkable. At 729 feet long, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald was a floating fortress. A giant among Great Lakes freighters, a vessel that dominated the shipping industry for nearly 2 decades. When this ship was launched in 1958, newspapers across America called it the Mighty Fitz. A ship so large and so reliable that it redefined what freshwater commerce could be. The Fitzgerald could carry more than 26,000 tons of taconite iron ore, processed ore pellets no larger than marbles, that formed the lifeblood of American steel production. From its home port in Superior, Wisconsin, the ship ran an almost unbroken route to Michigan and beyond, moving raw materials that fed blast furnaces across the nation. 17 years, hundreds of voyages, a reputation built on consistency, speed, and an almost legendary ability to navigate through weather that would intimidate lesser vessels. But none of that legacy protected it on the night of November 10, 1975. On that fateful evening, in the grip of what fishermen and sailors called the gales of November, this maritime titan vanished. It didn't slowly sink. It didn't send out distress calls. It didn't give its crew a fighting chance. Instead, this 729-foot giant carrying 29 men simply disappeared into Lake Superior's dark waters, and in doing so triggered a mystery that would perplex maritime experts, naval architects, and investigators for decades to come. Now, in 2025, nearly 50 years after that terrible night, the truth is finally rising from the lake bottom. The underwater drone's cameras are about to capture evidence that changes everything we thought we knew about what happened to the Edmund Fitzgerald. The voyage had started normally enough. On November 9, 1975, in the early afternoon hours, the Edmund Fitzgerald pulled away from the Burlington Northern Railroad dock in Superior, Wisconsin. Her hold was completely loaded with 26,116 long tons of taconite pellets, a full cargo. The weather forecast had mentioned storms moving toward the Great Lakes, but this was November, and November always brought storms to Superior. Captain Ernest M. McSorley, a man with more than 40 years of experience sailing these waters, wasn't concerned. McSorley was the kind of captain that other sailors spoke about in hushed, respectful tones. Calm, reserved, disciplined. A man who had navigated Lake Superior through some of its harshest seasons and emerged without incident. His crew of 28 others, engineers, deckhands, maintenance workers, cooks, and wheelsmen, trusted him completely. Many had served aboard the Fitzgerald for years, some for more than a decade. They knew this ship, they understood its capabilities, and they believed that if anyone could guide them safely through rough weather, it was Captain McSorley and the Mighty Fitz. Following behind them, maintaining a respectful distance of roughly 10 miles, was another freighter, the SS Arthur M. Anderson. This was standard practice during storm season. The two ships would maintain radio contact, and if conditions deteriorated, they could provide mutual support and assistance if necessary. Neither captain anticipated needing that help. Both vessels had crossed Lake Superior dozens of times in November conditions. Both had the experience and the equipment to handle what was coming, or so they thought. But Lake Superior doesn't follow anyone's assumptions. By mid-afternoon on November 10th, the weather system that meteorologists had been tracking began to intensify far beyond what the forecasts had predicted. The pressure was dropping, the winds were shifting, and the waves were growing with an anger that seemed almost personal. The Edmund Fitzgerald began to feel it first. The massive freighter's hull, so strong and so stable, started to shudder under the assault. By late afternoon, around 3:30 p.m., Captain McSorley made his first radio call to the Arthur M. Anderson. His voice was steady, but his words revealed the mounting trouble. He reported a severe list. The ship was tilting to one side. Several ventilators on the deck had been torn away. Part of the railing was damaged. And then the worst news. The Fitzgerald's radar had failed. In zero visibility, with waves becoming increasingly violent, McSorley could no longer rely on his own instruments. He would have to depend on the Arthur M. Anderson behind him to provide position updates that would become meaningless within hours. Yet McSorley remained composed. He confirmed that the pumps were still working. He told the Anderson that they were holding their own, even though the degree of listing the ship was experiencing should have alarmed him far more than his calm tone suggested. But how could he know? How could anyone know? The true danger wasn't something visible from the pilot house. It wasn't something an experienced captain could see or feel or measure with traditional instruments. The danger was happening in silence, hidden below the deck, in the cargo holds where water was beginning to creep in through openings that McSorley had no way of observing. At 7:10 p.m. that evening, as darkness fell completely over Lake Superior and the storm reached its violent crescendo, the Arthur M. Anderson made one final radio check with the Fitzgerald. The first mate of the Anderson, Morgan Clark, asked a simple question. "Fitzgerald, have you checked down?" It was a casual inquiry, a standard protocol to see if McSorley had verified everything below deck. McSorley responded with equal casualness. "Yes, we have," he said. Minutes later, Clark asked again, "How are you making out with that list?" And McSorley gave the response that would be the last words anyone would ever hear from the Edmund Fitzgerald: "We are holding our own." Those were 5 words, 5 ordinary conversational words from a captain who had no idea that his ship had perhaps 5, maybe 10 minutes left before the entire structure would come apart. Just 10 minutes after that final transmission at 7:15 p.m., the radar signal representing the Edmund Fitzgerald vanished from the radar screen aboard the Arthur M. Anderson. There was no warning, there was no alarm, there was no emergency distress call. The ship was simply gone. When Clark tried to raise the Fitzgerald on the radio at 7:22 p.m., 3 minutes later there was nothing but silence. The crew of the Anderson, experienced sailors all of them, were stunned. A ship nearly 730 feet long, weighing tens of thousands of tons, carrying 29 human beings, had disappeared from their radar and from human contact in what seemed like seconds. In the darkness and chaos that followed, search teams were dispatched to the area where the Fitzgerald had last been detected. What they found was almost incomprehensible. Debris scattered across the water, life rafts and lifeboats, some still in their launch straps, never even deployed. Not a single crew member was found, not a single body, not a single survivor. The entire crew of 29 men had vanished along with their ship, with no distress call, no radio goodbye, no time to launch lifeboats or emergency equipment. It was as if the lake had simply opened up and swallowed vessel whole. When the wreck was finally located 4 days later, resting at a depth of 530 feet in the darkness of Lake Superior, the first underwater cameras revealed something even more disturbing. The Fitzgerald had broken cleanly into two massive sections, lying roughly 50 meters apart with the central portion of the hull almost completely destroyed. It wasn't the wreck of a ship that had slowly filled with water and sunk. It was the shattered remains of a vessel that had been torn apart by forces so powerful that they had snapped a 729-foot steel structure like a piece of wood. This discovery immediately triggered intense debate among maritime experts. Investigators from the US Coast Guard launched an official inquiry. Naval architects examined every detail of the ship's design. Engineers ran simulations. Meteorologists analyzed the storms. Survivors of similar vessels shared their experiences. But even with all this expertise, all this investigation, the answer remained maddeningly unclear. How could a ship of this magnitude disappear so quickly? How could a crew with such experience not have time to radio for help? What had really happened in those final moments? Theories emerged. Some investigators suggested that hatch covers had come loose, allowing water to pour directly into the cargo holds. Others proposed that the ship had struck a shallow ridge on the lake bottom, creating a breach in the hull that rapidly expanded. Still others blamed the brittle steel used in the 150 steel that became dangerously fragile in freezing temperatures and violent wave action. The families of the lost crew members were frustrated. Veteran sailors refused to accept simple explanations, and the maritime industry found itself unable to fully understand why this particular ship, with this particular captain, on this particular night, had failed to survive conditions that other vessels had weathered. For nearly 50 years, the Edmund Fitzgerald rested on the lake bottom, its secrets locked away in the darkness and the cold. The underwater cameras of the 1970S and 1980 could provide only grainy, dim images, blurry glimpses of twisted metal and broken hull sections, but nothing clear enough to definitively answer the questions that haunted investigators and families alike. The wreck was studied, documented, and preserved as a protected underwater memorial, but the mystery remained unsolved, a frustrating gap in maritime history where science and engineering had reached the limit of what technology could reveal. And then, in 2025, everything changed. Modern, remotely operated vehicles, equipped with 4K cameras, advanced sonar systems, artificial intelligence scanning capabilities, and powerful lighting systems that could illuminate the wreck in unprecedented detail were deployed to Lake Superior. As the drone descended through the 530 feet of water, passing through absolute darkness, its powerful lights began to illuminate a site that no human had clearly seen in nearly half a century, the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, not as a dim shadow or a blurry shape, but as a detailed, three-dimensional structure where every crack, every fracture, every twisted piece of steel could be carefully examined and analyzed. The team on the surface watched in stunned silence as the video feeds began to come in. This was unprecedented. This level of clarity on a freshwater wreck at this depth was almost unimaginable just a few years earlier. As the drone's lights swept across the hull, the research team began to notice details that changed everything. And the first discovery was deeply significant. The hatch clamps, the steel fasteners that were supposed to hold the massive cargo hatch covers in place, were damaged in a very specific way. Many were missing entirely. Others were bent-backed, twisted as if they had been torn away suddenly by an enormous force, not loosened gradually over time by corrosion or normal wear. But the most shocking discovery came as the drone focused on a circular opening in the deck, a hole roughly 4 inches wide where a ventilation pipe had once been attached. The pipe itself was completely gone, and the steel around the opening had been torn and bent outward. This was the kind of damage caused by sudden, violent force, not the gradual degradation that would occur over decades in fresh water. Engineers who later studied the footage ran detailed simulations, and the results were terrifying. Under waves approaching 30 feet in height, Water rushing through such an opening could pour into the cargo hold at thousands of gallons per minute. But here's where the tragedy takes on an even darker dimension. The crew wouldn't immediately realize it was happening. The Edmund Fitzgerald was carrying taconite pellets, processed ore compressed into marble-sized balls. These pellets are extremely dense, far heavier than water, yet during the initial stages of flooding, they behave almost like porous stone. They absorb water. This means that the initial flood water wouldn't create a visible rising water line inside the hold. Instead, the water would be absorbed into the ore itself, remaining essentially invisible to the crew members who might check the hold or monitor the ship's various water detection systems. And this is where Captain McSorley's calm final transmission takes on tragic significance. From the pilot house on the upper deck, McSorley could see the severe list, the ship tilting to one side, and he could certainly feel the violent wave action. These were conditions he had experienced before during previous November storms. The pumps were running, supposedly keeping the water at bay. Everything above deck seemed to be under control. But far below, in the cargo hold, in the darkness and the cold, water was silently accumulating in the taconite ore. The bow was becoming heavier minute by minute by an amount that no instrument in the pilot house would immediately register. As the bow grew heavier, the aerodynamics of the ship began to change. With each passing wave, the heavier bow would plunge deeper into the trough between swells, creating increasingly violent impacts with each new wave crest. This created a dangerous feedback loop, a cascade of forces that built upon themselves. The heavier the bow became, the greater the impact force. The greater the impact force, the more stress was placed on the hull structure. And the hull structure, particularly the central midsection of this 729-foot-long vessel, was already operating near the edge of its design limits. The drone footage revealed something that cleansed this entire scenario. The steel plates of the bow section were bent in a very specific pattern, bent in a direction consistent with repeated downward force, as if the bow had been pressed repeatedly from the front by incoming waves. And critically, this damage was most severe where the brittle cold temperature steel of the 1950S would be most vulnerable. What the researchers were seeing was the final minutes of the Edmund Fitzgerald's existence, written in steel and visible in the patterns of the wreckage. The ship didn't sink because of one single catastrophic failure. It sank because multiple dangerous conditions aligned at precisely the moment when the vessel was most vulnerable. The destroyed ventilation pipe allowed water to pour in silently, and the taconite cargo absorbed that water invisibly. The brittle steel, weakened by the freezing temperature, became increasingly vulnerable to bending forces. The silent flooding lowered the bow without warning, and the massive waves that struck hour after hour, minute after minute, pushed the hull toward failure in a way that grew exponentially more dangerous with each impact. The crew had no time to react because they didn't know what was happening. Captain McSorley, with all his experience and all his expertise, had no way to see the danger developing beneath the deck. He felt the ship listing, yes. He observed the heavy waves, certainly, but he had no indication that the situation had passed the point of no return. From his perspective, the Fitzgerald was holding its own, and in those final minutes before catastrophe, he was fighting an enemy he couldn't see. Then came the moment when the weight of the water in the bow became so great that the ship could no longer maintain its balance. In the exact sequence that the drone footage now revealed, the bow plunged downward with tremendous force, while at the same time, the stern section was lifted upward by an incoming wave. The midsection of the ship, the central hull structure that connected these two sections, was suddenly subjected to forces that exceeded its design limits. In near-freezing temperatures with brittle steel, under the enormous stresses of a 729-foot vessel being bent at the midpoint, the structural integrity failed. The ship didn't sink. The ship fractured. It broke apart suddenly, violently, completely. The bow section plunged downward and embedded itself deep into the lake bottom sediment. The drone footage showed it sitting far deeper in the mud than any gradual sinking would have caused. This was the impact signature of a massive weight falling from a significant height. The stern section, now detached, rolled upside down and came to rest about 50 meters away, with steel plating torn outward in the unmistakable pattern of a sudden catastrophic break rather than the gradual failure of a ship slowly filling with water. The entire sequence, from the first water entering the broken ventilation pipe to the complete structural failure and sinking of the vessel, likely took less than a minute. Possibly less than 30 seconds once the final collapse began. There was no time to radio for help. There was no time to launch lifeboats. The recovery teams later found the lifeboats still secured in their straps, untouched, never deployed. There was no time for the crew to gather, to prepare, to do anything except perhaps realize in those final moments that something catastrophic was happening. That their ship, their home, their workplace for many of them for years on end, was coming apart around them. The discovery of this complete picture from the underwater drone footage represents something profound for maritime history. For the first time, investigators had visual proof of the entire mechanism of failure. They could see exactly where the water had entered the destroyed ventilation pipe. They could see how the hatch clamps had been torn away by sudden pressure. Evidence of the tremendous forces at work. They could see the deformation pattern in the hull that matched mathematical models of a ship being bent to its breaking point. They could see the impact signature in the lake bed that indicated the speed and force of the descent. And they could understand finally how a captain as experienced as Ernest McSorley, commanding a ship as renowned as the Edmund Fitzgerald, could find himself in a situation where no experience, no preparation, no expertise could have provided a defense. This discovery sparked a new era of maritime safety. The findings have led to reforms in hatch cover design for freshwater freighters. Steel specifications have been reevaluated, weather alert systems have been improved, hull inspection standards have been strengthened. The Edmund Fitzgerald, even in death, continues to teach the maritime industry hard lessons about the limits of engineering, the power of nature, and the importance of respecting the forces at work on the water. But perhaps more significantly, this underwater drone exploration has provided closure, not in the sense of ending the tragedy, but in the sense of finally understanding what happened. The families of the 29 crew members who lost their lives can now understand that their loved ones didn't die because of negligence or poor seamanship. They died because a chain of mechanical failures and environmental forces aligned in a way that was essentially inevitable once it began. They died serving aboard a vessel that was pushed beyond the limits of what human engineering of that era could withstand. They died with a captain who did everything in his power to command them safely, but who was fighting against forces and failures that happened in the darkness beneath his feet. Captain Ernest McSorley was 63 years old. He had spent more than 4 decades navigating the waters of the Great Lakes and the world's oceans, accumulating wisdom, experience, and respect that set him apart as one of the finest masters in the shipping industry. His intention was to retire at the end of the 1975 shipping season. This would be one of his final voyages before he stepped away from the sea for good. His wife, Nellie, was waiting at home in Toledo, Ohio, ready to begin a new chapter of their lives together. But Captain McSorley never came home. John McCarthy, the first mate, was 62 years old, born in 1913, living in Bay Village, Ohio. He was a man of discipline and professional excellence, the kind of officer who formed the backbone of Great Lakes maritime operations. James Pratt, the second mate, at 44 years old from Lakewood, Ohio, was part of the senior command structure that kept the Fitzgerald running with meticulous precision. Michael Armagos, the third mate, was a younger officer at 37 years old, already establishing himself as a skilled navigator in the Great Lakes tradition. These were the faces of authority on the bridge of the Edmund Fitzgerald. But there were other faces throughout the vessel. In the engine room, below the deck, working in the darkness and the noise and the constant mechanical rhythm of the ship's massive engines, were the engineering crew. George Hall, the chief engineer at 60 years old, had been managing the complex machinery of the Fitzgerald since 1969, responsible for keeping this floating city operational. Edward Binden, the first assistant engineer at 47 years old from Fairport Harbor, Ohio, worked alongside him, understanding every valve, every pipe, every piston of the propulsion system. Thomas Edwards, the second assistant engineer at 50 years old from Oregon, Ohio, and Russell Haskell, the second assistant engineer at 40 years old from Millbury, Ohio, completed the critical engineering team. For Russell Haskell's family, the Fitzgerald's sinking was particularly devastating. His brother Eugene had actually helped get Russell the job aboard the ship, and when the Fitzgerald went down, Eugene was haunted by the feeling that he should have been there, that if he'd still been walking aboard, perhaps things would have been different. But of course, they wouldn't have been. Russell was newly aboard the ship, making one of his early voyages, working to earn money and build a life. He was taken by the sea before he'd had the chance to become the experienced sailor that his family tradition suggested he might have been. Russell's sister Vivian and his brother James remember vividly the day the call came. James was at work when Vivian called him with the news a ship had sunk and they weren't sure if Russell was aboard. Throughout that shift, he waited, updating his family as information came in slowly, piece by piece, moment by moment, until the devastating confirmation arrived. Northwestern Mutual Insurance officially announced that the Edmund Fitzgerald had sunk and all 29 men aboard were lost. Then there was Oliver Champeau, known as Buck to his friends and family. He was from Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin, and he'd taken the job on the Fitzgerald because November was a season when sailors earned premium pay, the hazard pay for navigating the dangerous waters during storm season. Oliver had been building his life with his wife Eileen and their daughter Deborah. He had purchased property on Clark Lake in Jacksonport, and he was working hard to pay down as much of the mortgage as possible so that when he eventually settled down ashore, he and his family would have a home they could truly call their own. Oliver never got to enjoy that house. He never got to see his daughter grow up. The 1975 voyage would be his first aboard the Fitzgerald, his first and only voyage. His daughter, Deborah Gomme-Felder, would spend decades thinking about her father, wondering what he would have become, what kind of grandfather he might have been, what conversations they might have had. Every November, the family remembers. On the 50th anniversary of the sinking, Deborah traveled to Michigan with her children and grandchildren to leave flowers and a hand-drawn photo on the beach, a small gesture of remembrance for a father she barely had the chance to know. There were younger men too. Carl Pakel was just 20 years old, working as a watchman aboard the Fitzgerald. He was the youngest member of the crew, his whole life ahead of him, representing the next generation of Great Lakes sailors. Mark Thomas was a deckhand at just 21 years old from Richmond Heights, Ohio. Paul Ripa was another deckhand at 22 from Ashtabula, Ohio. These were men who should have had 5 decades of life ahead of them. These were men who were just beginning their careers in maritime commerce. They had barely stepped into adulthood when the lake claimed them. Joseph Mazes, a special maintenance man, was 59 years old from Ashland, Wisconsin, and he had already made an extraordinary decision that reflected his character. He had survived 30 years of sailing on the Great Lakes, navigating through countless storms, learning the maritime profession inside and out, and he had recently decided that the 1975 shipping season would be his last. He was going to retire, he was going to spend time ice fishing, deer hunting, and snowmobiling in his beloved Wisconsin wilderness. Joseph Mazes was looking forward to a peaceful retirement, to enjoying the rewards of a life spent in faithful service to the maritime industry. He never got to take that first day of retirement. These were the lives that disappeared when the Edmund Fitzgerald slipped beneath the waves. These were the dreams, the plans, the families, the futures that were razed in an instant. And for decades, the families were left with unanswered questions, with incomplete explanations, with multiple conflicting theories about what had actually happened to their loved ones. The official investigation began almost immediately after the wreck was discovered on November 14, 1975. Just 4 days after the Fitzgerald sank, the US Coast Guard undertook what would become an exhaustive, controversial investigation that lasted for nearly 3 years before the final report was released on February 13th, 1978. That report was over 100 pages long, meticulously detailed, carefully researched, and ultimately frustrating to many people because it didn't provide the kind of definitive answer that families and the maritime industry needed. The Coast Guard's investigation looked at every possible theory. They examined the weather conditions. They studied the ship's design. They analyzed the cargo. They interviewed the captain and crew of the Arthur M. Anderson, the only vessel that had been in radio contact with the Fitzgerald during its final hours. They sent divers down to the wreck multiple times, collecting evidence, photographing the damage, trying to piece together what had happened. One theory that emerged from the initial investigation was that the hatch covers had not been properly secured. The hypothesis suggested that as the ship pitching and rolling in the heavy seas, one or more of the cargo hatch covers had come loose, allowing water to flood directly into the hold. This theory had some merit, particularly because it could explain the rapid flooding and the sudden sinking. The problem was that the 1,970 Sarah diving technology simply couldn't provide clear enough evidence to definitively prove this theory. The underwater cameras were grainy, the visibility was limited, and the divers themselves could only spend limited time at the depth of 530 feet. Other investigators proposed the shoaling theory, the idea that the Edmund Fitzgerald had struck an uncharted shallow area of the lake bottom, creating a breach in the hull that rapidly expanded under the stress of the storm. This theory also had supporters, particularly among maritime engineers, who argued that if the ship had struck bottom, the subsequent impact forces could have caused catastrophic structural failure. Then there was the structural failure theory, which suggested that the brittle steel used in the construction of the Fitzgerald during the 1950s had simply snapped under the enormous stresses of the storm. The hull had broken apart, not because of water ingress, not because of shoaling, but because the 729-foot structure had been stressed beyond its design limits and the material itself had fractured. This theory was supported by the fact that the wreck was clearly broken into two major sections, which seemed more consistent with a sudden fracture than with a gradual sinking and settling. The problem with all of these theories was that without clear evidence, without the kind of high-resolution underwater imaging technology that wouldn't become available until the 21st century, it was impossible to definitively prove which theory was correct. And this ambiguity frustrated everyone involved. The families who wanted answers, the maritime industry that wanted to know what to fix, the investigators who wanted to close the case with certainty rather than speculation. This is where the 2025 underwater drone expedition becomes so historically significant. For the first time, the research team had the technology to actually see the wreck in high definition, to examine the damage patterns in detail, to measure and analyze the structural failures with mathematical precision. And what they discovered was that multiple factors had worked together in a lethal combination, exactly the kind of systemic failure that is most dangerous in maritime operations because it's almost impossible to predict or prevent with a single safety improvement. The hatch clamps were torn and missing. This meant water was getting in. The ventilation pipe opening had been destroyed. This meant water had a direct pathway into the cargo hold. The taconite ore was absorbing the water silently, invisibly, adding tremendous weight to the bow without triggering any immediate alarm. The brittle steel of the 1950S was vulnerable in the freezing temperatures. The repeated impacts of 30-foot waves were putting enormous stresses on the midsection of the ship, and Captain McSorley, despite all his experience and expertise, had no indication that the situation had become critical until it was far too late to respond. What made this realization so significant was that it explained why no distress call had been sent, why the crew hadn't had time to deploy lifeboats, why not a single survivor had made it off the vessel. The failure of the Edmund Fitzgerald wasn't a gradual process that would have given the crew time to recognize the danger and take defensive action. It was a cascade of interconnected failures that built upon each other, accelerating toward catastrophe with exponential speed. From the moment that water began entering through the damaged ventilation pipe to the moment when the ship broke apart was likely measured in minutes, perhaps even seconds, once the final structural collapse began. The impact of this understanding rippled through the maritime industry. The US Coast Guard, which had been somewhat uncertain about what specific safety improvements were needed without knowing the exact cause of the sinking, now had clear guidance. In response to the findings and to the broader lessons learned from the Fitzgerald disaster, the Coast Guard implemented sweeping reforms. The 1973 Load Line Regulation Amendment, which had allowed for lower freeboards, the distance between the waterline and the lowest point of the deck where water could enter, was rescinded. This meant that ships would have more reserve buoyancy, making them less prone to capsizing and more able to survive flooding. The Coast Guard made pre-November inspections of hatch closures and ventilation closures mandatory for all Great Lakes vessels, ensuring that these critical openings were in perfect condition before entering the dangerous storm season. Water level sensors and water ingress alarms were added to ships so that crews would be immediately alerted if water was entering the hull, allowing them to respond before the situation became critical. The immediate aftermath of the sinking also saw the implementation of emergency position indicating radio beacons, EPIRBs, on all commercial vessels. These devices could automatically transmit a distress signal even if the crew didn't have time to manually send a radio message, ensuring that even in catastrophic situations, the Coast Guard would know that the ship was in trouble and could dispatch rescue assets. By 1977, the Coast Guard required all ships of 1,600 gross registered tons or greater to be equipped with depth finders, giving captains better information about their position relative to underwater hazards. By 1980, survival suits with attached strobe lights were required to be stored in crew quarters and at regular workstations, dramatically improving the chances that crew members could survive in the frigid waters of Lake Superior if they had to abandon ship. The maritime industry also upgraded its weather forecasting capabilities. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration began using a different system to predict wave heights, providing more accurate information to ship captains planning their routes. The underwater navigation charts for Lake Superior were improved and made more detailed, adding information that could help captains avoid dangerous shallows and understand the bottom composition. Most significantly, the US Coast Guard created an enhanced weather warning system for the Great Lakes, ensuring that real-time storm information could be transmitted to ships well before dangerous conditions develop. The technological improvements have been staggering. Modern ships operating on the Great Lakes today have GPS systems and digital navigation equipment that provides far more accurate positioning than the radar systems available in 1975. Satellite communications and the Global Maritime Distress and Safety System, GMDSS, ensure that ships can stay in constant contact with the Coast Guard, eliminating the possibility of a vessel simply disappearing without anyone knowing what happened. Ships built today are fundamentally different from the Edmund Fitzgerald in terms of design and construction. Modern Great Lakes bulk carriers feature improved hull strength, advanced materials that don't become brittle in cold temperatures, and watertight hatch covers with significantly improved clamping mechanisms that can withstand far greater forces than the systems of the 1970s. The freefall lifeboats that some modern ships carry can launch entire crews to safety in minutes, and every crew member is trained and equipped with immersion suits that can keep them alive even in the freezing waters of Lake Superior. These improvements have been extraordinarily effective. Since the Edmund Fitzgerald sank in 1975, there have been no major shipwrecks on the Great Lakes, a record that spans nearly 50 years of continuous maritime traffic. Modern ship captains are more conservative in their decision-making, more willing to wait out storms in harbors rather than trying to push through them. The Mark W. Barker, the first US-built Great Lakes bulk carrier in nearly 40 years, represents the state of the art in modern design, incorporating every lesson learned from the Fitzgerald disaster and decades of subsequent improvements. When maritime engineers were asked if a modern ship built to today's standards could survive the storm that claimed the Edmund Fitzgerald, the answer was unequivocal: yes, for a number of factors. Modern vessels are built more survivable and loaded less conservatively. This is the legacy of the Edmund Fitzgerald, not just in the life save because ships are now safer, but in the confidence that the maritime industry has in its ability to protect the people who work on the water. But the legacy of the Edmund Fitzgerald extends far beyond maritime safety improvements. In 1976, just months after the tragedy, Canadian folk singer Gordon Lightfoot released a song that would become one of the most enduring and beloved pieces of music in American cultural history. The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald was a 6-minute, 478-word ballad with no chorus, an unusual structure for a popular song, particularly one that was released during an era when radio stations preferred short, catchy, easily memorable tunes. Lightfoot was himself deeply connected to the Great Lakes. He was a child of the region, a sailor who understood and respected the water. When he learned about the Fitzgerald disaster, he was haunted by it, troubled by the loss of these 29 men, compelled by a sense of obligation to try to tell their story accurately and respectfully. But he was also terrified of doing it wrong. He worried about being inaccurate, about coming off as corny, or worse, about appearing to exploit a tragedy for personal profit. The families of the 29 crew members had just suffered an unimaginable loss, and Lightfoot was acutely aware that his song could either provide comfort and dignity to their memory, or it could feel like opportunistic commercialization of their suffering. So Lightfoot did his research with meticulous care. He read the newspapers, he studied the details, he interviewed people who had expertise about the incident, he fact-checked his lyrics obsessively. His bassist, Rick Haynes, recalled that Lightfoot had become so focused on accuracy that he engaged in a heated argument about whether the ships on Lake Superior carried 26,000 or 6,000 tons of ore. Lightfoot had initially gotten it right, 26,000 tons, but then second-guessed himself and wanted to change it to 6,000. Haynes had to convince him that his first instinct had been correct. Lightfoot's dedication to precision in commemorating this tragedy reflected his deep respect for the families and for the memory of the 29 men who died. When the song was released, nobody could have predicted what would happen. It was the wrong length, too long for radio. It was the wrong style, somber and serious, not upbeat and fun. It had the wrong structure, no catchy chorus, just a relentless narrative that took 6 minutes to unfold. And yet, against all the odds and against all the expectations of the music industry, the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald became a massive hit. The song reached number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart in 1976, second only to Rod Stewart's Tonight's the Night. But more than that, it captured the hearts of the American public in a way that transcended typical pop music success. It became an anthem for the Great Lakes region, became a memorial for the 29 crew members. It became the primary vehicle through which the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald would be transmitted to future generations. As Lightfoot himself explained years later, the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald is my achievement. It's a song you can look back on. You don't walk into a room and people don't say the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The song has a quality and total feel all its own. We've performed it at every opportunity since the night we wrote it. It's true and fair, a great legacy. It stood the test of time. The song's significance became even more apparent when maritime historians began to reflect on what Lightfoot's composition had accomplished. One historian noted that between 1875 and 1975, the Great Lakes had experienced an astonishing 6,000 shipwrecks, averaging one per week for an entire century. And yet, people can name only one. The Edmund Fitzgerald is the Great Lakes shipwreck that people know, and they know it because of Gordon Lightfoot's song. The song has kept the memory alive. It has kept the names of the 29 crew members alive. It has ensured that their sacrifice and their loss would not be forgotten, would not be relegated to obscure historical records, but would be commemorated generation after generation. Lightfoot's respect for the gravity of the subject matter was evident in how carefully he controlled the use of the song. When late-night television host Jimmy Fallon proposed doing a comedic skit based on the Fitzgerald story, Lightfoot firmly rejected the idea. He refused to allow his composition to be treated as entertainment fodder. He understood that these were real people, real families, real grief, and the song deserved to be treated with the dignity that the tragedy deserved. The impact on the families was profound. Patrick Devine, a former deckhand who had actually worked on similar vessels during the same era, recalled that he had quit following the Fitzgerald story because he couldn't cope with the emotional weight of it. When Lightfoot's song was released, Devine initially felt angry. He thought the song was exploitative, another example of people taking advantage of others' suffering for profit. But gradually his perspective changed. He came to understand that Lightfoot had genuinely cared about the families and the memory of the crew, and the song became a vehicle through which he could process his own grief and respect the memory of his colleagues. Other family members found comfort in the song. They heard their loved ones' names preserved in Lightfoot's lyrics. They heard the story of their loss told with respect and accuracy. They understood that their husbands, their fathers, their brothers, their sons were not going to be forgotten, not because of a newspaper article that would eventually be filed away in an archive, but because a song would be sung for generations, keeping their memory alive, ensuring that the Edmund Fitzgerald and the 29 men who died aboard her would remain part of the cultural consciousness of North America. But even as the song became a cultural phenomenon, the families faced other storms, legal and financial storms, that were in some ways as devastating as the literal storm that had taken their loved ones. The families who lost crew members aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald discovered that maritime law was a complex and often inequitable system. Insurance settlements were unequal. Some families received more compensation than others, depending on various factors that had nothing to do with the degree of their loss or their financial need. The Ogilvy Norton Corporation, which handled the insurance for the vessel, became a contentious point for many families. Debo Champo Gomez, who had lost her father Oliver in the sinking, described the subject of insurance settlements as a sore subject. The families, already devastated by their loss, found themselves having to navigate a legal and financial system that often seemed designed to minimize payouts and protect corporate interests rather than to provide equitable compensation for those who had lost breadwinners and family members. This was the dark underside of the maritime tragedy. The reality that even as Gordon Lightfoot's song was touching hearts and minds across the continent, the families were fighting through legal proceedings to try to get fair compensation for their losses. The emotional trauma was compounded by the financial trauma, and the injustice of inadequate compensation added another layer of pain to an already devastating tragedy. The Edmund Fitzgerald rests 530 feet below Lake Superior's surface, its secrets finally revealed. For nearly 50 years, questions haunted us. Now, advanced underwater drone technology has provided the answers, showing us exactly how and why this maritime giant catastrophically failed. This discovery has transformed maritime safety, saving countless lives through innovations born from tragedy. The 29 crew members who perished are remembered not just through Gordon Lightfoot's iconic song, but through every safety regulation protecting ships today. What are your thoughts on this discovery? Comment below and share this video. Subscribe for more groundbreaking maritime stories that continue shaping our understanding of history.